Hello again, YouTube people. I just remembered something I forgot to show you, and that's Farrar's HEI. Stay. There we go. Alright. I wanted to say a little something about HEI. And I know this generates all kinds of controversy with not everybody in the DeLorean community, just certain people within the DeLorean community. I call them gurus. They call themselves gurus. These are the people who have kind of taken it upon themselves to be like the keepers of the faith. You know, their job is to make sure that nobody strays too far from the straight and the narrow and the orthodox and the way the car was built at the factory, which, as you can see on this thing, is a moot point. This little car couldn't see factory with a telescope. But anyway, Farrar is running HEI, high energy ignition. And let me just give you a little thumbnail history of HEI. HEI was developed by General Motors in the early 1970s. It's a General Motors trademark. HEI, the letters HEI are General Motors trademark. It was quickly adopted by all the other car companies, but they didn't call it HEI, of course. But what happened was in the early 70s, the federal government started turning the screws on the car companies to get lower emissions and better fuel economy out of their existing engines. And so General Motors discovered that simply by increasing secondary spark voltage, that they would get more complete combustion, more consistent combustion, more reliable combustion, and moderately better fuel economy. And so they developed this HEI system that all the other car companies very quickly adopted for themselves. I mean, John DeLorean is an outlier. He's like one of the few people who didn't adopt it. Prior to the 1970s, what DeLoreans have from the factory is really pre-70s ignition. It is controlled by an electronic module, but just in terms of its caliber and its capabilities, it is no different than breaker point ignition. Prior to the 1970s, before the electronic modules controlling the coil, turning the coil on and off, the coil was switched on and off by breaker points, contact points that would actually open and close inside the distributor. And you had to necessarily limit secondary voltage because as those breaker points would open and close, they would arc and they would actually end up welding themselves together. So prior to the 1970s, secondary ignition ran 8,000 volts, maybe 10,000, 12 if you were lucky. Comparatively low by today's standards. And General Motors discovered that if you were to, now that you had the benefits of an electronically controlled module, you weren't limited by the breaker points. So they came up with HEI so that way you could have these higher secondary spark voltages with all the benefits to get off of that. And it's not just General Motors, the Society of Automotive Engineers, the SAE people, they did a study, a scientific study, to say, well, does General Motors actually know what they're talking about, or is this just marketing hype? And I've uploaded the paper that they produced, the SAE paper, to the internet, because the SAE people came to the exact same conclusions. They said simply increasing secondary voltage going into the cylinders will yield more complete combustion, it will yield more consistent combustion, it'll lower emissions, increase fuel economy, with no other changes to the engine whatsoever. Simply increasing the secondary voltage will accomplish this. They used the Chevrolet 350 in their study. Bone stock Chevrolet 350. And they looked at some other things too. They looked at the protrusion of the spark plug into the cylinder, and they found that made no difference. They looked at spark plug designs. They looked at multi-electrode designs. They looked at exotic metals, and found that those made no difference. The only difference, the only thing that made a difference was the increased secondary voltages, and those made a measurable difference. So much so that people that respond, if you read that SAE paper, like half of it, at least half of it, is people responding to the SAE. That thing's like 30 or 40 pages long. And you've got other manufacturers responding, you've got other people responding, and overwhelmingly positive responses. Unlike the gurus I mentioned earlier that are like, don't do this is terrible. And this is the problem. What happens, HEI is like a three-legged stool. You've got to have all three components. Otherwise, not only will you not have HEI, what you will have is a bunch of problems. And there are people out there who've done two of the three, and then they have problems. And they say, well, obviously this HEI doesn't work because I had a problem. I say, well, you've got the third leg of the stool. If you don't have all three legs, the stool is going to fall over. So let me give you the three things necessary for HEI. And you've got to have all three. If you leave any of them off, you will not have HEI. What you will have is problems. And number one is the coil, the inductive coil itself. The way an inductive coil works is you've got big windings that are attached to the input voltage coming off the car that are surrounded by many, 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 many more small windings that are connected to the secondary output here, going to your spark plugs. And the ratio of little windings to big windings determines how much the voltage can be stepped up. It's like a transformer in reverse. So in the 1950s and 1960s, you had comparatively low winding coils. The ratio of windings was comparatively low. Now they have the capabilities of producing these high winding coils, like this one here. This is a Pertronix coil. I'm a total Pertronix snob. I think they are the Cadillac of coils. And this is a 40,000 volt coil, which means it is capable of producing 40,000 volts. It doesn't mean that just taking it out of the box and sticking it on your car is going to produce 40,000 volts. Remember, there's three legs of the stool. This is just the first leg. But the first leg is 40,000 volts capable. Way, way, way more than the Bosch coil that came in these DeLoreans when they were new. I bet you that Bosch coil is probably 15, maybe 18,000 volts potential at most. Given what I'm about to tell you now on leg 2, I don't even think it produces anything near that. Because you've got the coil that is capable of producing the high voltages. The second thing that you need is more voltage going into the coil. This is Farrar's input coming off of his car into the coil. He's running full charging voltage into his coil. You will notice that Farrar has no ballast resistors. He is running full charging voltage into his coil at Pertronix's recommendation. The people who made his coil themselves state that their coils are made for full charging voltage, 13.5 volts. They'll take all you can give them. Don't do this with your Bosch blue coil. You will burn it up. But if you have a real coil and it needs to be at least 1.5 ohms internal resistance, Pertronix also makes a 3 ohm coil. This is the 1.5 ohm, which is what I use. You can run full charging voltage into that coil, no problem. I do it on all my vehicles, and I've been doing it for years, and they love it. They eat it up. So that's the first and second legs. A coil that can handle more voltage into the coil, and then second, more voltage into the coil. Remember, with those ballast resistors, DeLorean is only getting like 8 volts into its coil. And the way it works is your output voltage is a multiplier of the input voltage based on the ratio of windings. So less voltage in, by necessity, is less voltage out. The only way you're going to get more voltage out is to put more voltage in. The only way you're going to be able to put more voltage in is to get rid of that Bosch blue coil and put a real coil on it. you still do not have HEI. You've got leg 1 and leg 2. This is leg 3. Leg 3 is spark plug gap. The gap on the spark plug, the minute that the coil, the minute that the spark can jump the gap on the spark plug, that is the most voltage that the coil will discharge. Even if it's capable of discharging more, it's not going to do it because it's already jumped the gap. It's kind of like a very rudimentary voltage regulator. So suppose you've got the high winding coil, you've got the increased voltage going into the coil, you've got the potential to produce some very high secondary voltages. If you leave your spark plug gap at 0.024 inches, you're not going to have HEI. You will basically just have factory ignition with new components, because as soon as it jumps that little teeny weeny plug gap, that is all the coil's going to discharge. If you're going to run HEI, you've got to increase the plug gap. Farrar's running 0.046 inches here, which is pretty much a standard Ford plug gap. When Ford increased their voltages, like I said, all the car companies except for John DeLorean went to HEI. They didn't call it that, but it was HEI caliber ignition. And Ford pretty much adopted 0.046 inches as their standard. Now General Motors, there's a fellow around the corner here. He has a Chevy pickup truck, and I helped him put a set of plugs in it one time, and his plug gap from the factory, this is General Motors' recommendation, is 0.06 inches. Now, yeah, I think General Motors developed HEI, said amen brother, and just took it to the max. I don't know if I necessarily run 0.06. He's having good luck with it. But 0.046, hell, you could double it, 0.048. You could take your DeLorean plug gap, double it to 0.048, and if you've got the high winding coil and more voltage into it, it will be able to jump that 0.048 gap, no problem, and then you will have HEI. Because what will happen is the secondary charge will build up in the coil and continue building up in the coil until it's high enough to jump that 0.048 gap. It may not be 40,000 volts, might be, like maybe 30,000 volts, but it's definitely going to be higher than jumping that little 0.024 plug gap. And I know it generates all kinds of controversies with these people, these purists who get very upset if you start talking about HEI. And for some reason, this is like the biggest red flag to wave in front of them. Of all the red flags to wave, HEI just seems to get them the most upset. I don't know why. Their name is not on the title. The way I see it, when their name appears on the title, they get a vote. If their name's not on the car title, they don't get a vote. But I promise you, HEI works. I've got it on my own vehicles. Everything from pickup trucks to Volvo to Lincolns to a school bus. I promise you, it works. It works, it works, it works. I promise you, it works.